Good morning, everyone. Because I had such a great time talking with Professor Lietch a few weeks ago, I knew I had to get him back on the show to talk about Alfred Hitchcock, a filmmaker who he is an expert on and who I just really love. The main topic of our conversation this time is Hitchcock's British films. Hitchcock started his directing career in the 1920s in England before moving to America in 1939, and while many of his most enduring works came from his Hollywood period, he was just as prolific and masterful in England, where he produced all time great movies like The Man Who Knew Too Much, The 39 Steps, and The Lady Vanishes. If you're not super familiar with Hitchcock beyond his most famous films, I hope this conversation will serve as a good introduction to the endlessly rich world of his entire career. They didn't call him the master of suspense for nothing. Well, I appreciate you talking for another episode here because I I really loved getting a chance to talk on the last one, but I really do want to get into this Hitchcock stuff just for my own personal satisfaction at this
Well,
point.
okay. So if you want to get into this Hitchcock stuff, there's an ideal way to get in, and it's your remark. But you got in touch with me originally right after you had seen the 1956 Man Who Knew Too Much,
Hmm.
which of course is an American remake, an auto remake of Hitchcock's 1934 British film, same
Hmm.
title, same subject. Not a shot-by-shot remake by any means. It's not a Gus Van Sant job, but it's
Right.
a reasonably close remake.
Hmm.
Um, and I said that even though most people preferred the American film, I had always preferred the English one. And
Hmm.
you said that in the meantime, you had now watched the English film,
Yeah.
and you could see good things about that and good things about the American film too. And then you quoted Hitchcock, his famous remark to Francois Truffaut. The English film was the work of a talented amateur,
Hmm.
but the American film was the work of a true professional.
Hmm.
I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that remark quoted.
Really,
And
really, wow.
more and more over the years, I've come to think this is a deeply silly thing to say, and Hitchcock must have known it.
Oh well, that's kind of like the fun. So the fun thing about reading the Francois Truffaut, like just that whole interview series, is that you can read it in kind of two ways. You can read it thinking, okay, this is we get to hear from the master himself. We get to hear what he thinks about his process, but you also have to recognize that you're listening to Alfred Hitchcock, who is famously a massive goofball, and so there's there's a tinge of like irony, I think, in a lot of his responses, and I feel like you have to recognize that in reading it. There's a lot to glean from it, like really interesting stuff, but there's also a slight edge of I don't know if sarcasm is the word, but he definitely infuses his answers to the questions with a little bit of his sense of humor, I feel.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure that I'd say it's sarcastic, but I do think I when were the Truffaut interviews around the time of between Marnie and Rear Window.
Mhm.
Sorry, between Marnie and Torn Curtain, like
Yeah, yeah, it was like the
around
mid '60s.
1965.
Yeah.
Um, and by that time, whenever Hitchcock spoke, for the record, he was always performing Hitchcock.
Yeah,
He was never just chatting. He was
right.
always doing himself. So whether or not he was being sarcastic, I think he was presenting a kind of authorized Hitchcock version of Hitchcock.
Mhm.
But that particular remark increasingly has driven me up a wall because I think the 1934 Men Who Knew Too Much, by my count, was Hitchcock's 17th completed film.
Mhm. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing even as I read that, right? Because so just for the show. We the thing I really want to talk about is the Alfred Hitchcock's British period, more so than his American period, because we're all like even on the show we've talked about North by Northwest. I think we mentioned Rope in an episode, and we've kind of been like throwing some little Hitchcock things out there here and there. And the movies that people tend to be familiar with are, I think, mostly his American films. Like I think the most popular ones I can think of from just like looking at the data on websites and stuff. You have North by Northwest, The Birds, um, Psycho, uh, Rear Window. It's one more that I'm thinking. I don't know why it's not coming to me, but you know what I mean. It's mostly like it's probably his like '50s to early '60s stuff that people really still talk. Vertigo, right? Obviously, because it was top Sight and Sounds poll semi recently, if I remember correctly. I know that might have been like a decade ago at this point, but it still feels recent
It's
to me.
not quite a decade ago, and that was the first time that Vertigo had
Yeah,
topped that poll, which always was topped by Citizen Kane in the past.
right.
But
Yeah.
Vertigo seems to me a special case because it's a film that everybody thinks is a great film, but some people just don't even like, let alone
Yeah.
love.
Well, I mean, you
Some
get that with
A lot of
Citizen Kane
people
too.
really do not get Vertigo. They don't get what the appeal of it is. It's
Mhm,
slow moving, it's kind of obscure. Kim Novak, not one of Hitchcock's greatest actresses,
mhm.
and they just don't see what the fuss is. But now, since the Sight and Sound poll, everybody says, "Oh well, okay, I don't see what the fuss is," but it's obviously a great film. The fault,
Yeah, of
the
course.
fault isn't mine.
Yeah, exactly what you were saying about Citizen Kane last time,
Yeah,
that
right. People never say that about North by Northwest.
Right,
Nobody
yeah.
ever says, "Well, I don't care for it personally, but I understand that it's a great film."
Mhm,
And as for Psycho, I think that most people don't think of that as great film, not great film. They think of it as scary film, not scary film.
mhm.
But yes, I think you're right. The films that people that you and I are likely to run into, that people are most likely to remember of Hitchcock, are American films. And I've often
Mhm.
wondered, would this be true if we were in the UK?
It's a
If
good
we
question.
asked
Yeah.
if we asked English citizens which Hitchcock films are you most familiar with, would they say the American films too? When I'm in England, I always forget to ask.
No, that's a good question though, because there's obviously, there's the fact that we're American. There's the fact that the American films are more recent, so maybe they're more in people's minds. Maybe more people have seen them. I think that could be a big thing too, because the so his British work is basically like pre 1940, roughly, and when I first encountered a lot of these movies on the Criterion Channel, which is a streaming service that for the Criterion Collection, basically, and they acquire a bunch of stuff, but they've had this collection on there of British Hitchcock films, right? And when I first saw that, my immediate reaction was like, "Oh, this is interesting. I would never have even thought to watch these or even known where I could do that." Even though I'm sure many of them are streaming on other streaming platforms for like if you could rent them or something, but I think a lot of them are not readily accessible.
Yeah,
So that I think could be part of it too, where it's like it's very easy to find, Rear Window or Vertigo or North by Northwest. Like there's no problem there. But I think for something like I don't know, The Lodger, where are you going to watch The Lodger? It's like a silent film, and I'm not sure how easy it is to get a copy of that. But you can get it on the Criterion Channel. So recently, I just kind of decided like, why not? Let's see what these are about. And I think the thing that stuck out immediately was that my initial kind of arrogant thought was like, oh, these are like his older movies. These are the ones that'll be kind of like the proof of concept for the stuff that he would later like really flourish in America, right? But then when you watch them, you're like, these are very accomplished movies on their own. And you realize that the whole talented amateur thing is kind of a funny comment, but like he didn't move to America until he was like 40 years old, I think. And so he had been doing plenty of work in the British film industry for quite a while, and I think that it's worth looking at these movies not as just kind of like a work in progress towards later masterpieces, but kind of their own thing, and they're interesting in a lot of ways that I think they're unique for. Um, yeah.
if Hitchcock had retired instead of moving to America, he would have made more movies than Orson Welles, more movies than David Lean,
Hmm.
more movies than Quentin Tarantino to date, although
Hmm.
Tarantino's still got more movies in him, I assume. Um, the list goes on.
Hmm.
So it's nice for us that the list didn't end there. I mean, I think there are 23 features at that point, but you really spoiled yourself if you started the silence with the launcher, because the launcher seems to me incontestably the best of Hitchcock's silent films.
Well, he did say in the Hitchcock Truffaut interviews that he considers that his first real movie.
Yeah, but
Um,
that's Hitchcock talking. It's, I think, even more interesting to look at the British press when that film was released.
mhm.
One of the reviewers really did say this is the most magnificent film England has yet produced. That's
Yeah, I think
quite
I
a
read that.
heady comment to get about your third movie.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I can only imagine.
So if we talk about talented amateurs, boom, The
That
Locker would have
actually
been a
checks out.
reasonable movie to say that about.
Right, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Um, Yeah.
there are lots of other things that I love in other Hitchcock silence, but The Lodger is, I think, the only one that I love every minute of from beginning
Hmm.
to end. And I
Yeah.
don't think it's any coincidence that out of all of his silent films, that's the one he went back to most repeatedly in his later career. At one point, he thought of remaking it.
Hmm.
And in fact, it was made by, I guess, John Brahm in 1944 with Laird Krieger. I haven't
Hmm.
seen that film. It's in even more limited circulation than the Hitchcock film.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, but Hitchcock plunders that film, for instance, as late as Frenzy. You can see
Okay.
that there are things that he's interested in the launcher that he goes back to in Frenzy.
Oh yeah, and I feel like the Lodger definitely like as you watch it and you see kind of you can see little things that he would later like kind of develop in other movies. There's little Hitchcockian kind of storytelling elements that you can tell very clearly that it's an Alfred Hitchcock movie, even with the differing style of the silent movie.
Your
They're
idea of proof
definitely
of concept, I think, is highly
right.
relevant here. The difference is that in lots of Hitchcock silence, you'll see flashes of the Hitchcock that we know and love. That is the Hitchcock that flourishes in America, but then
Hmm.
they're gone.
Hmm.
So it's a little bit like, I don't know, a grab bag or a box of Cracker
Yeah,
Jacks. It's
sure.
got treats in it, but not everything is going to be a treat. Not everything
Hmm.
is going to be equally a treat. As
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
saying this, I'm already feeling bad because some of the Hitchcock silence are completely achieved, it seems to me, from beginning to end. I'm thinking of The Farmer's Wife,
Hmm.
not one of my favorite of films, even among his silent films, but it is what it is. And if you're into what it is, it
Hmm.
works really well for 2.5 hours.
Wow,
Yeah, right. I mean,
that's long.
it's longer than North by Northwest for
Yeah.
crying out
Wow.
loud. I've always been attached to what is that film he made in 1931, The Skin Game,
Mhm,
about a very proper English family's battle with the parvenu who's moved in and who's trying to take over
mhm,
everything. They're fighting back, which means inevitably fighting dirty, and
mhm,
the way that they get sucked down into that fight. I think that's
sure.
a terrific little film, but the only other people I know who have seen it are Hitchcock people.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, that's there's only 2 of his silent movies available on the Criterion Channel.
Oh, what's
It's
the other
just,
one?
so it's The Lodger, and I think it's Downhill, which I didn't watch that one. It's the only one on their collection I haven't seen. But yeah, it's only
Yeah,
those 2.
yeah, Downhill. You can wait on Downhill. Downhill is not a must see, and
That's interesting. I
and
wonder why they chose that one. I don't know.
availability maybe,
Yeah, it must be, yeah.
or maybe because they were able to get a good cleaned up print, or
Yeah,
were able to restore it. Because
yeah,
that's what Criterion
right.
specializes in doing. Downhill is a particularly good example of the proof of concept film because it is, except for the very beginning, the prologue, which is the first 15 or 20 minutes, it is an episodic film.
Mhm,
The title is entirely accurate. It's about a guy who it's about two school friends in a prep school. One of them gets involved with a woman who gets pregnant,
mhm,
and he's a scholarship student, and he's unwilling to take the blame for this because he'll get thrown out. So his friend, who is not a scholarship student, agrees to take the blame. He gets thrown out instead, and he gets disowned by his family, and the rest of the movie basically charts the sort of adventures that he goes through
mhm,
after he's tossed out of the school and tossed out of the family home.
mhm,
Um, Interesting concept. Some of the episodes are a lot more interesting than other episodes.
mhm.
And it doesn't take all that long to see where the film as a whole is going, but individual episodes play out in sometimes in quite unexpected ways.
Yeah,
So, yeah, The Launcher's a good movie if you're in the mood for that kind of a movie.
right, sure, sure. Um So I want to just quickly run back to just a brief comment you made where you said like you see flashes of the Hitchcock that we know and love, right? And just because I have no idea who listens to this radio show, honestly, but I always feel like I'm trying to play to people who may not be familiar with the things that we're talking about sometimes. Because obviously, if you're reviewing new movies, sure, that's just like you're doing a public service. You're letting people know if you like the movie or not, or if they should go see it, right? But when you're talking about old things, I always feel like this semi need to justify why we're talking about them, right? And so the Hitchcock we know and love. Who is the Hitchcock that we know and love? For people that don't know Hitchcock. Now, I know that you've taught Hitchcock classes before many times, I'm sure at this point. Um, so I guess the the best way I can think to phrase this. If you're teaching a class on Hitchcock, What is on syllabus day, on that first day of class, what is it that you're telling people who sign up for that class on the first day to introduce them to this world of films that they're gonna just immediately start coming into?
Wow, I would have expected that people who showed up on the first day of class would actually already know who Hitchcock
I'm
was.
sure they know who he is, but they may
No,
have
recent
only seen one
experience.
movie. They might only know who he is. They've heard the name before or something like that. But for people that like, if you've seen a million Hitchcock movies, you know what we're talking about. But if
Mhm.
you've maybe seen one or two, you might want to know why it's like, what is it about this particular person that warrants this kind of like almost obsessive kind of deep dive?
Okay, so the first day of class. Hitchcock is the master of suspense, capital M, capital S. Hitchcock is, apart from Walt Disney, who's a really illuminating comparison, Hitchcock is the only filmmaker I know who's had a genre named after him.
Hmm.
There's such a thing, of course, as a Scorsese film uh,
Hmm.
or a Steven Spielberg film, but it's not the same thing at all. Both of those directors have a much wider range than Hitchcock. It's not a fluke that the suspense film that, for instance, if you today released a suspense film and reviewers loved it, uh, at least a third of them would compare it to Hitchcock.
Hmm.
He sets a standard for what people like to think of as the suspense film, although I would argue it's a very specific kind of suspense film. I mean, there are all sorts of films, there are all sorts of suspense films that Hitchcock doesn't make or hardly ever makes.
Hmm.
He doesn't like whodunits, for instance.
Hmm.
He does like man on the run films.
Yes, he
He's
does.
particularly attached to films in which somebody, well, like the hero of Downhill. This is one of the proof of concept things. You take the hero of Downhill, you isolate him from his school chums, you isolate him from his family, and then you push him out into the world. So what Hitchcock
Hmm.
does with this motif in his suspense films is add the cops in a murder.
Right.
Now he's not just alone and friendless; he is wanted, and he has good
Hmm.
reason to remain in hiding. So
Hmm.
all of the relationships that he forms while he's on the run are going to be risky.
Hmm.
It's turning up the temperature. And it reminds me of another remark of Hitchcock's. Some people say that films are slices of life. He said, I think of my films as slices of cake.
Right. Yeah.
And it's connected to probably the most famous remark he ever made about filmmaking. Cinema is life with the dull bits left out.
Hmm.
So the idea is that in a Hitchcock film, you experience lots of the same kind of emotions that you would in real life, but now everything is fraught,
Hmm.
everything is stepped up, everything is higher stakes. The films aren't a reflection. No, nobody's going to write a paper on Alfred Hitchcock in my summer vacation.
Hmm.
The films don't deal in the kinds of incidents that most of their audience will have gone through.
Hmm.
They instead deal with the kinds of fantasies the audience has.
Hmm.
And many of these fantasies, maybe most of them, are negative. They're
Hmm.
fears. Hitchcock cinema is basically a paranoid cinema. What if blank, blank, blank? But they're also, and here North by Northwest is a great example, and the English sound films, I think, are even better examples. Along with the paranoia goes wish fulfillment.
Hmm.
I'm on the run. The police are looking for me. Everybody is looking for me. I've teamed up with this woman. Actually, I've tried to team up with this woman in the 39 steps
Hmm.
by entering her train compartment, saying, "You've got to hide me from the police," kissing her on the mouth. Not the best way, it seems to be, to ingratiate yourself with her. And then, of course, she immediately turns you over to the police. The wish fulfillment part of that is you will win her over by
Hmm.
the end of the movie. She will be yours. That's a very high price to pay in real life. It seems to me, for being involved, as the principal suspect in a murder.
Hmm.
But in the movies, it's not a high price at all. It's an entirely appropriate price, and
Hmm.
it's a great payoff. Hitchcock made quite a few movies like that. I mean, the three best known are the 39 Steps, Sabotage, and North by Northwest.
Hmm.
But there are lots of movies that use the same man on the run kind of thread.
Hmm.
One of them, for instance, is Young and Innocent. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I did watch that one. Yeah.
That's always been a favorite of mine, mainly because nobody has ever heard of it. In
Yeah, well, that's
England,
just one on that. It's on the Criterion Channel, so.
it's called The Girl Was Young.
Mhm.
One of the things I've always liked about it is that its star, Nova Pilbeam, was the kidnapped child in The Man Who Knew Too Much.
When I read that, I was blown away because I feel like it looked like she aged like 10 years in like
Yeah,
3
yeah.
years.
Well, maybe just working with Hitchcock extra 10 years.
Yeah,
Somewhere around.
right.
Um, but that's a perfect example of somebody who's wanted by the police, who gets in with a woman who um, originally turns up her nose at him and threatens to turn him over to the cops, who incidentally happen to be her father.
Mhm,
But who, by the end of the movie, long before the end of the movie, has won her over, and in the very last line of the movie, shows signs of winning her father over
mhm.
too. I mean, she says in the film's last line, um, "Don't you think it's about time we invited him to dinner?" So yes, that's the fate of Mr. of Robert Tisdale. He's going to be having dinner with at the home of the policeman who's been dedicated to chasing him down.
Mhm,
This is Hitchcock with a happy ending. But there are English Hitchcock films that don't have happy endings, or that whose happy
mhm,
endings are not all that happy, or that arrive at the very last instant, or that aren't all that believable.
mhm,
And here, and the two main exhibits I'm thinking of are Sabotage,
mhm.
which is based on Joseph Conrad's novel The Secret Agent, which is a truly nihilistic novel. I mean, even more depressing than the Hitchcock film. Um, and A Secret Agent, which
Mhm,
is based on some Somerset Maugham stories about very early stories in the spy genre.
mhm,
And in both of these films, uh, the the sympathetic characters, the identification figures, are driven to the extremes of their ability to take anything, and then the films sort of close and rescue them.
mhm.
With little. I mean, at the end of The Secret Agent, you see a postcard that says. Safe home, but never again. Signed, Mr. and Mrs. Ashington. You think, oh, okay, no problem. Okay, never mind. Oops,
That's
forget it.
that's kind of a funny thing that I think the first time I recognized this was when I watched The Wrong Man, where The Wrong Man ends in a very sad place. But then there's a title card that says, "But everything's okay," basically. And I recognized that after I watched The Lodger, which kind of does a similar thing where The Lodger has like a whole extra scene of saying, "And everything's happy in the end." And I think there was some special feature with The Lodger that I watched that, and the person that was talking put it really well, where he mentioned it's basically it's a Hitchcock second ending, where the end happened, but then for some reason, either outside of his control or for any kind of storytelling necessity, there's another ending that happens to take the ending that just happened and try to lift it up in some capacity so that the audience doesn't leave in a bad mood, right? But I feel like Hitchcock does this in a very cheeky way a lot of the time, where you kind of know that he's doing it, and you know that he's making a concession, but he's doing it in a way that the audience is like kind of aware that it's like not necessarily his like intention of the story, I guess. And maybe it is, maybe there's part of that, but I do think that he kind of knows what the natural ending of the thing is, and whatever was imposed on him, he does in a very kind of cheeky way.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would say there's a real ending and then there's an added ending, but I do love this idea of second endings,
Mhm,
alternate endings. And I agree with you. The Wrong Man is the classic example, especially
mhm,
since the true story that's based on didn't
mhm.
have that happy ending.
Exactly right. But I read and I knew it immediately when I watched the movie that something sounded wrong, and I looked it up and was like, "Oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah,
that makes a
never
lot
mind.
of sense."
But there are times when Hitchcock can raise that alternative ending to an art form.
Mhm,
Think of, for instance, the very last, I guess it's two shots of North by Northwest.
mhm,
You have Eve Kendall
mhm,
dangling over the edge of Mount Rushmore. Um, can Roger Thornhill pull her up? Oh, he thinks he can. He's not sure. Oh, oh, oh. Then there's a dissolve, and they're in a Pullman berth going home. And then she says, "This is silly," and he says, "Yes, but I'm sentimental." And then there's a cut to the train entering a tunnel.
mhm.
Perfect. That's Hitchcock's way of saying, I know that you want to have a cliffhanger ending, but I also know that you want to have this. And,
Mhm.
I've now found a way to integrate both these. In a
Right, yeah.
way, this whole ending is a correction of the ending of Saboteur, where the
Mhm,
spy is dangling from the edge of the Empire, not the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty,
mhm,
and is not saved.
Hmm.
But he's a spy, so too bad.
Sure, right.
Tough. Um, this It's interesting. I think you see Hitchcock playing with alternative endings relatively early on.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
but there's one film, and it's not an English film, it's one of his early American films where this really comes to a head. It's Suspicion. Have you
I
seen
actually
it?
haven't seen Suspicion yet. No.
Okay, Suspicion is about a woman who becomes convinced that her husband, who is a scape race, who's done all sorts of illegal things, she finally becomes convinced that he's planning to kill her.
Hmm.
It's based on a novel called Before the Fact, in which the wife becomes convinced that the husband is going to kill her, and she's correct.
Hmm.
And at the end of the novel, she's just waiting for him to kill her. That's clearly what's going to happen. Um, so Hitchcock buys this. Um, he buys the novel or I'm not sure whether it was he or RKO who bought the novel.
Hmm.
He's going to direct the novel. He wants to cast Cary Grant as the scape race, but he says nobody's going to believe that Cary Grant is a killer.
Right.
So we have to find a way to change the ending. And Suspicion goes through more rewrites and more convoluted rewrites than any other Hitchcock project.
Hmm.
At one point, I mean, it's a 99-minute film. It's basically an hour and 40 minutes. But at one point, RKO edited it down to 55 minutes and took out any serious suggestion that Cary Grant was really going to kill Joan Fontaine. And it had a happy ending. I don't want to spoil Suspicion,
Oh,
especially
it's
for
fine by
you
all
if you haven't
means.
seen it. Suspicion has, as it stands, an ending that most audiences think is happy. But I don't think it's happy. When I watch the last shot of that film, I am haunted. I think, yeah, John Fontaine's character thinks this is a happy ending, and most audiences think it's a happy ending too. But I do not think this is a happy ending. Good luck,
Hmm.
guys.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think like bringing it back to like his British movies, I got the sense that Hitchcock's kind of his and again, this is reading him in Hitchcock Truffaut. I feel like his analysis of his work stems a lot from how much he felt like he was able to control the audience response the way he intended necessarily. And I think that the sometimes when like a movie's story doesn't resolve in like if like it's like you're saying about Suspicion where it's like you don't find it to be a particularly happy ending even though maybe what happens leads it in some direction that makes you think like it should be, and some people do recognize it as such. I was thinking when I watched Sabotage, Hitchcock described Sabotage as something that's like uneven, not exactly what he was going for. He didn't like that John Loder played the detective. He didn't think that it worked, and he felt that at the end it didn't give the experience that he wanted the audience to have. And my thought when I watched Suspicion was like, I don't know that apparently he wanted Robert Donat to play the role of like the male lead in that. And I was thinking because Robert Donat plays the lead in the 39 Steps and is so charismatic, and there's so much that like you instantly like him and you root for him and you root for the romance to some degree, even though there is a little bit of darkness there too. But regardless, Robert Donat's a very charming guy, and John Loder in that role is not really. But I feel like that almost kind of works because there's no happy ending for Sabotage. You can't make like Sabotage have an ending that feels happy, right? So it's interesting because like even back then, I feel like there was some sense of like there's a semi happy ending in the sense that like everything with the characters is resolved and they'll be okay from like the law, or they'll be okay and can continue moving about their lives. But in the case of something like Sabotage, like I can't imagine how they aren't irrevocably harmed and changed by the events that take place.
Sabotage is a wonderful example of a throwaway second ending. I mean,
Hmm.
all the gears are in place for Sylvia Sidney's character to be arrested for murdering her husband,
Hmm.
for having arranged the death of her kid brother.
Hmm.
And that's clearly where the story is heading. And in fact, moments before the film ends, she says to the inspector in charge, he's dead.
Yeah.
Then the house blows up.
Hmm.
And immediately, or almost immediately, seconds later, um, the inspector says, um, she said that he was dead before the house blew up. Or was it after?
I
I
don't
can't
remember.
remember. And that's the end of the movie. I mean,
Yeah.
if she had just waited for 5 seconds, no problem. So
Hmm.
let's pretend she waited for 5 seconds. Not a big
Yeah.
deal here.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. All right. We'll see you next week for part 2.